Na área esquerda, texto sobre sólido de cor escura, com uma grande frase inspirada no título My family invited my ex to Christmas and told me to stay in a hotel. The security footage made the entire room go silent. Baseado na história, no idioma inglês. Abaixo. Na área da direita, uma imagem da personagem principal com um sorriso discreto, tranquilidade, como na referência enviada. Abaixo o roteiro. The neon sign of the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge flickered with a dying rhythmic hum, casting a sickly red glow across the dashboard of my truck. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, staring at the plastic motel room keycard resting on the center console. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the windshield and muffling the sound of the nearby highway. 3 miles up the mountain road was the Blackwood Estate, a timber and stone property my grandfather built, and the place I had spent every winter of my life. I was technically still a 20% stakeholder in the property. Yet tonight, on the eve of the annual family gathering, my mother had handed me this cheap plastic keycard in the driveway of the estate and quietly asked me to leave. She had not yelled. She had not been angry. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, she had looked at me with a mixture of pity and exhaustion, explaining that Sutton's anxiety was simply too high. She said my presence was destabilizing the fragile peace they had managed to build. Sutton was my former business partner, and until 8 months ago, my fiancé. He was currently inside the warmth of my family's home, carving the roast, pouring the wine, and playing the role of the savior, while I was sitting in a freezing truck outside a roadside motel. The unraveling of my life hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, methodical dismantling. When Sutton and I first started Blackwood Restorations, the division of labor made sense. I was the systems architect and structural engineer, the one who spent days crawling through foundations, running electrical grids, and installing the high-end environmental monitoring networks we sold to wealthy clients. Sutton was the face of the company. He handled the contracts, the client dinners, and the accounting. I trusted him implicitly, a blind spot that eventually cost me almost everything. When the company accounts began hemorrhaging money, Sutton didn't panic. He carefully, quietly, shifted the paper trail to make it look like my experimental tech acquisitions were the cause of the deficit. By the time I realized the scale of the financial hole, he had already gone to my family. He didn't go to them as an accuser. He went as a martyr. He sat in my mother's kitchen weeping, claiming he had drained his own savings, trying to cover my reckless spending to protect the family name. My mother, who had always valued social perception above all else, swallowed the narrative whole. My older brother, Thomas, who resented my independence anyway, eagerly backed Sutton. When the relationship ended, Sutton didn't leave. He entrenched himself. He convinced my family that the only way to save the Blackwood estate from being seized by creditors due to my alleged debts was to transfer the primary deed into an LLC he controlled, supposedly to shield it. I tried to fight it. I brought spreadsheets, bank statements, and tax records to my family, trying to show them how Sutton had manipulated the ledgers. But data requires patience to read, and Sutton offered an emotional, immediate solution. I was branded the erratic, irresponsible one. Sutton was the adopted son who was staying behind to clean up my mess, which brought me to the motel room. I grabbed my overnight bag and stepped out into the freezing air, the snow crunching under my boots. I swiped the keycard and pushed open the heavy wooden door of room 114. The air inside smelled of stale smoke and heavy industrial cleaner. I dropped my bag on the worn floral bedspread and pulled my laptop from my backpack. I didn't open it to wallow in old photos or write angry emails. I opened it because of a notification that had pinged on my phone 3 hours earlier, just as my mother was politely banishing me from the estate. It was an automated alert from the Blackwood environmental grid. When my family locked me out of the property's management accounts, they remembered to change the Wi-Fi passwords, the alarm codes, and the smart lock access. But they didn't understand the underlying architecture of the system I had custom-built for the estate 2 years prior. I hadn't installed simple security cameras. I had integrated a comprehensive diagnostic network designed to monitor the aging foundation of the property. It included thermal imaging sensors in the crawl spaces, moisture detectors in the timber, and a closed-loop data log that bypassed the commercial internet entirely, sending packets directly to a secured server I hosted off-site. I never bothered to tell them about the deep-level admin access, because they wouldn't have understood what it meant. And until today, I hadn't had a reason to check it. The alert on my screen was a localized temperature drop in the eastern foundation block, accompanied by a moisture spike. This was the exact section of the house Sutton had recently convinced my family was suffering from severe natural rot. It was the core reason he was currently pressuring my mother to sell him the remaining 80% of the property for a fraction of its market value, claiming he was doing them a favor by taking on a condemned structure. I pulled up the raw data stream. The numbers didn't make sense for natural decay. The moisture levels weren't rising gradually with the winter thaw. They were spiking violently, consistently, between 2 and 4 in the morning every third day. I tapped my fingers against the cheap laminate desk of the motel room, staring at the screen. I needed a physical verification, and I needed someone inside who wasn't entirely under Sutton's spell. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Yara. She was my cousin, a pragmatic environmental lawyer who only attended these family gatherings out of a begrudging sense of obligation. During the fallout, she hadn't actively defended me, but she had remained conspicuously quiet, refusing to join the chorus of praise for Sutton. I typed out a text. I told her I was at the motel and asked if she could step outside to the back terrace for a phone call. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Her voice was hushed, the wind howling slightly in the background. She asked what I wanted, noting that things were tense enough inside without me stirring the pot. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I asked her to go down to the basement, to the utility corridor behind the main boiler, and look at the secondary water main. Yara sighed heavily, complaining about the cold, but I heard the crunch of her boots turning back toward the house. I kept her on the line as she navigated the creaking wooden stairs down to the basement. I guided her past the storage crates and the old furniture until she reached the utility corridor. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its irritated edge. It was entirely flat. She described a heavy-duty industrial hose connected to the bypass valve. It was snaked through a deliberately cut hole in the drywall, feeding directly into the structural dirt trench of the eastern foundation. Beside the valve was a programmable digital timer, the kind used for large-scale agricultural irrigation. I asked her to read the brand name on the timer. It was a specialized model, the exact type Sutton's new shell company had purchased in bulk 3 months ago, ostensibly for a landscaping project downtown. He wasn't saving the house. He was systematically destroying its foundation to force a panic sale. Yara didn't ask questions. She told me to stay where I was and hung up. I didn't stay where I was. I opened a secure terminal on my laptop and began pulling the archived logs from the thermal sensors in the crawl space, cross-referencing them with the local network's MAC address history. The system logged every device that came within range of the estate's nodes. I spent the next 4 hours compiling a very specific timeline. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The sky was a pale, bruising gray. I packed my laptop into my bag, brushed the snow off my truck, and drove up the mountain. I didn't knock when I arrived at the Blackwood estate. I still had the physical brass key my grandfather had given me when I was 16. I unlocked the heavy oak door and walked into the foyer. The house was quiet, smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. From the formal dining room, I could hear the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of morning conversation. They were having breakfast. I walked into the room, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. My mother was at the head of the table, holding a ceramic coffee mug. Thomas was buttering toast. Sutton was sitting on my mother's right, looking perfectly rested in a tailored cashmere sweater. Yara was seated at the far end, pushing her eggs around her plate. She looked up when I entered, her expression unreadable. My mother stood up immediately, her face tight. She started to say my name, her tone carrying that familiar, tired reprimand, but I didn't look at her. I walked straight to the mahogany sideboard, where Thomas kept the smart home hub I had installed years ago. I pulled an HDMI cable from my bag, plugged it into my laptop, and connected the other end to the large screen mounted above the fireplace, which they usually use to display digital family photos. Sutton stood up, his voice dripping with forced calm. He asked me what I was doing, reminding me gently that I had agreed to give everyone space. He looked at Thomas, silently asking my brother to handle the situation. Thomas took a step toward me, telling me to pack up my toys and leave before he called the local sheriff. I ignored him and pressed a key on my laptop. The screen above the fireplace flickered, replacing a rotating image of a summer vacation with a stark monochromatic grid. It was a thermal imaging feed of the estate's crawl space, time-stamped from 2 nights prior. The room grew quiet, confused by the sudden change in visual. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke clearly, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on Sutton. I explained that when I built the network, I installed subsurface thermal optics to monitor the heat retention of the original stonework. I told them I had never unlinked my admin credentials because no one had ever asked me to. I hit play. The thermal footage was completely silent. On the screen, a heat signature in the shape of a human figure crawled through the narrow dirt passage beneath the eastern foundation. The figure was glowing bright orange against the cold blue of the earth. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m. The figure reached the support pillars, and the bright orange heat signature of their hands interacted with a metallic object, the digital timer Yara had found. A moment later, a spray of cold water registering as dark blue on the thermal spectrum began to blast directly into the timber supports. Thomas frowned, stepping closer to the screen. He muttered that it could be anyone, a trespasser, a vandal. I pressed the spacebar, pausing the video. I opened a secondary window on the screen, displaying a scrolling list of network logs. I pointed to a specific line of code. I explained that the estate's mesh network logs the MAC address of any phone attempting to ping the local router. I highlighted a specific device that had disconnected from the guest bedroom's node at 3:10 a.m. and reconnected in the basement node at 3:12 a.m. I pulled up a certified diagnostic report from Alden, an independent structural auditor I had retained months ago when the company numbers first looked suspicious. I had forwarded the sensor data to him early this morning. His preliminary assessment, displayed on the screen, confirmed that the water damage was not natural, but localized, pressurized, and deliberate. The structural decay was synthetic. Finally, I opened a PDF. It was a corporate filing I had pulled from the state registry. It showed the purchasing history of Sutton's new LLC, the one my mother was preparing to sell the estate to. The list of assets included 12 industrial irrigation timers, purchased 3 weeks before the structural issues at the estate suddenly accelerated. The security footage remained frozen on the screen, the glowing orange figure caught with their hands on the valve. Nobody screamed, nobody threw a glass. The absolute silence in the room was heavier than any argument could have been. My mother stared at the screen, her coffee mug suspended halfway to her mouth. Her eyes darted from the thermal image to the network log, and finally to the man sitting beside her. Sutton's posture had completely collapsed. The relaxed, confident angle of his shoulders vanished. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the screen. He stared intently at his empty ceramic plate, his jaw working as he tried to construct a pivot, a new narrative, a way to frame this as another one of my paranoid delusions. But the data was too granular. The synchronization of his phone's movement with the thermal imagery and the physical timer in the basement left no room for his usual emotional manipulation. Thomas looked physically ill. He turned to Sutton, asking a single sharp question about the timer. Sutton opened his mouth, but Yara interrupted. She calmly stated that she had been in the basement an hour ago. She had taken photos of the valve, the timer, and the bypass hose. She set her phone on the dining table, the bright screen showing the physical evidence matching the thermal feed perfectly. The illusion shattered entirely. My mother slowly lowered her mug to the table. The look she gave Sutton wasn't just anger, it was the profound, humiliating realization of her own gullibility. She had traded her son for a man who was actively destroying her family's legacy to steal it. I didn't wait for the apologies. I didn't want them. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, dropping it onto the table next to Yara's phone. It contained a legally binding buyout agreement drafted by my attorney weeks ago, demanding the return of my initial capital investment in Blackwood Restorations, plus penalties in exchange for my 20% stake in the estate. It also included a formal notice of intent to report the structural sabotage to the State Insurance Board if the terms weren't met within 14 days. I unplugged my laptop, the screen above the fireplace returning to the smiling, oblivious family photos. I packed my bag in the quiet room. As I turned to walk out, my mother finally spoke, her voice thin and fractured, asking me where I was going. I told her I was going back to the city. I had a new project starting on Monday, and I needed to prepare. I walked out the front door, locking it behind me, and drove back down the mountain, leaving them at the table to dismantle the mess they had chosen to build. The drive back down the mountain was the quietest I had experienced in years. My phone buzzed incessantly in the passenger seat, first Thomas, then my mother, and finally a string of frantic, unstructured texts from Sutton. I didn't answer any of them. I let the battery drain and die somewhere past the county line. By the time I reached my apartment in the city, the adrenaline had faded, leaving a heavy, hollow exhaustion. I had won the confrontation, but there was no real victory in watching your family realize they traded you for a con artist. Monday morning brought the harsh reality of untangling the legal mess Sutton had created. I met with my attorney, a sharp, unyielding woman named Evelyn. We reviewed the terms of the buyout I had dropped on the dining room table. The 14-day window was a generous formality. Sutton was backed into a corner, but animals in corners are unpredictable. Yara called me on Tuesday from her office. She was the only family member whose calls I accepted. She told me the aftermath at the estate had been ugly. Sutton hadn't confessed. Even with the thermal footage and the physical timer sitting on the table, he tried to claim I had hacked the system and planted the device to frame him. But my mother, for all her flaws, was not blind to physical reality once it was shoved in her face. Thomas had physically escorted Sutton off the property, but kicking him out of the house didn't remove him from the LLC. Sutton still held the keys to Blackwood Restoration's remaining operational capital. On Thursday, I went to buy a coffee near my new job site, and my debit card was declined. I immediately logged into my banking app. A freeze had been placed on my personal accounts. Sutton had filed an emergency injunction, claiming I was attempting to embezzle company funds by demanding a buyout, while the company was allegedly in debt. It was a desperate stalling tactic, but it was effective. He was trying to starve me out financially, betting that I wouldn't have the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. He underestimated how thoroughly I had prepared for this exact scenario over the last 8 months. Evelyn didn't panic. She filed a counter-motion citing the evidence of structural sabotage and insurance fraud. She also contacted Alden, the independent auditor. Alden's final report was devastating. He didn't just confirm the water damage. He found structural stress fractures in the support beams that predated the water damage, indicating someone had used heavy machinery to compromise the load-bearing integrity before introducing the moisture. It was a calculated multi-stage demolition. The real surprise came the following week. My apartment buzzer rang at 7 in the evening. I checked the intercom monitor and saw my brother Thomas standing on the street corner, looking deeply uncomfortable in his tailored coat. I buzzed him in, curious but entirely on guard. He didn't come to apologize. When he sat on my sofa, he refused the water I offered and immediately launched into a frantic explanation of the estate's finances. The bank, having caught wind of the structural issues and the sudden halt in the LLC transfer, was threatening to pull the mortgage modification. Thomas looked at me with the same entitled expectation he had always worn. He wanted me to come back. He wanted me to use my contractor licenses to repair the foundation at cost, essentially asking me to clean up the mess he and my mother had allowed Sutton to make. He framed it as a family duty. He said our mother was a wreck, that the scandal was ruining her social standing, and that if I really cared about the Blackwood name, I would drop the buyout demand and fix the house. I sat across from him, watching him desperately try to maintain his position of authority. I realized then that the evidence hadn't changed their fundamental view of me. They didn't see me as an equal who had been wronged. They saw me as a utility they had foolishly discarded and now needed back. I told Thomas the buyout terms were non-negotiable. I told him the foundation was his problem, Sutton was his problem, and the bank was his problem. I watched his face flush with anger as he realized he had absolutely zero leverage. He tried to raise his voice, attempting to lecture me about loyalty, but the words sounded hollow and pathetic in my living room. I calmly opened the front door and waited. He left my apartment in a bitter silence, leaving me to prepare for the final legal strike. The legal dismantling of Sutton took less time than the emotional toll of the preceding 8 months. Once Evelyn submitted Alden's finalized structural audit to the State Insurance Fraud Division, the freezing order on my accounts was not just lifted, it was aggressively reversed. The authorities recognized that Sutton's shell company had filed an anticipated insurance claim for the supposed natural foundation rot just days before I exposed the irrigation timer in the basement. It was no longer a civil dispute over corporate sabotage. It was a documented, premeditated attempt at defrauding a major insurance provider. Faced with the reality of a state investigation, Sutton's remaining bravado evaporated completely. We didn't have a climactic screaming match in a crowded courtroom. The final shift in power happened in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at Evelyn's downtown firm. Sutton sat across the long wooden table, flanked by a visibly stressed defense attorney he had clearly hired in a panic. He looked significantly older, the confident posture gone, the tailored cashmere replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack suit. He didn't make eye contact. He just silently signed the dissolution papers, formally transferring the remaining operational capital of Blackwood Restorations back to me and accepting a civil settlement that drained whatever personal funds he had left to avoid a harsher criminal sentencing. I watched his pen scratch across the thick paper, expecting to feel a surge of vindication. Instead, I felt only a quiet, absolute detachment. The fate of the Blackwood estate was far less surgical. Without my capital or my labor to repair the deeply compromised structural beams, my mother and Thomas were left entirely out of options. The bank, now fully aware of the intentional foundation damage, refused to refinance the property. 3 months after the mediation with Sutton, I saw the real estate listing online. They were selling the timber and stone house my grandfather built as a condemned teardown, forced to accept a fraction of its historical value just to clear the lingering debts. Yara texted me the day they finally moved their belongings into storage, noting that Thomas had bitterly blamed the local real estate market, while my mother had simply blamed the harsh winter weather. They never acknowledged their own complicity in handing the keys to a thief, and I finally stopped waiting for them to. I took the restored capital from the settlement and leased a small, open-plan commercial space on the industrial side of the city. I didn't attach the Blackwood name to it. I started fresh, focusing strictly on the proprietary environmental monitoring tech I had developed, leaving the physical restoration business behind entirely. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the air outside the large warehouse windows carrying the first sharp freezing bite of winter. I was sitting alone at my new drafting table, finalizing the sensor schematic for a large commercial client. I reached into my desk drawer to grab a spare flash drive, and my fingers brushed against a small, rigid piece of plastic. I pulled it out and set it flat on the clean blueprints. It was the faded, cheap keycard from room 114 at the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge. I had kept it in my bag for almost a year, an unconscious anchor during the legal storm. I looked at the worn plastic edge, then looked out the window at the city skyline glowing steadily in the dusk. I swept the keycard off the table and into the wastebasket, turned on my desk lamp, and went back to work on my own foundation.
The narrative analysis of the Blackwood family saga reveals a profound intersection of psychological manipulation, fragile family dynamics, and the ultimate triumph of empirical data over fabricated narratives. At the center of this tragedy is a calculated campaign of gaslighting orchestrated by Sutton, a former partner who systematically dismantled the professional and personal standing of the protagonist. Sutton weaponized emotional vulnerability and social perception to obscure his own financial theft. Instead of confronting the missing capital with facts, he crafted a false reality where he played the selfless martyr protecting the family from alleged reckless spending. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective because it preyed on the existing biases within the family structure. The mother and brother, deeply invested in maintaining their social reputation and uncomfortable with independence, eagerly accepted this emotional performance. They chose the comfort of a convenient lie over the harsh reality of objective truth, effectively negating their own blood relative and banishing them to a freezing roadside motel. This dynamic highlights a severe social dysfunction rooted in the prioritization of outward appearances. The Blackwood estate, a symbol of family legacy, became the very instrument used to tear the family apart. Sutton convinced the family to transfer the property deed into a shell company under the guise of protecting it from fabricated creditors while secretly orchestrating the physical destruction of its foundation. The social tragedy lies in the complicity of the family. Even when presented with initial spreadsheets and tax records, the mother and brother refused to engage with the data because it required patience and a willingness to dismantle their preferred reality. They branded the protagonist as erratic, allowing Sutton to entrench himself further. The narrative exposes how toxic social structures within a family can completely blind individuals to logic, leaving them vulnerable to predators who know how to speak the language of victimhood and status preservation. The turning point of the saga represents a fascinating clash between human deceit and technological objectivity. The protagonist, a skilled systems architect, had previously installed a comprehensive closed-loop environmental diagnostic network beneath the estate. This custom-built grid, functioning independently of the commercial internet, became the silent and incorruptible witness to the crimes being committed. When an automated alert triggered due to an unnatural temperature drop and moisture spike, it initiated a sequence of events that shattered the carefully constructed illusion. The thermal imaging sensors captured the undeniable truth of a human figure manually activating an industrial irrigation timer in the crawlspace, systematically flooding the structural supports to force a condemned sale and commit insurance fraud. By cross-referencing device connection logs with the thermal footage, the protagonist eliminated any possibility of a deniable narrative. The data did not care about social standing or familial loyalty. It simply presented the physical reality of the sabotage. The confrontation that followed was won through the overwhelming weight of undeniable evidence. When the thermal footage and network logs were displayed, the psychological hold over the family evaporated instantly. The legal and social consequences were absolute. Sutton was forced into a civil settlement and corporate dissolution to avoid criminal sentencing for insurance fraud. Left with a ruined estate and the humiliating realization of their own gullibility, the mother and brother were forced to sell the family legacy for a fraction of its value. They never fully acknowledged their role in the disaster. The protagonist, meanwhile, walked away with their capital and sanity, using the betrayal to build a completely new life.